She was just texting her mom when the cop grabbed her wrist and smashed her phone under his boot. Tears filled her eyes as he tightened his grip, until a sharp voice cut through the air. "Step away from my daughter." The woman? Attorney General Monica Davis. But what happened next would shake the entire system. The sun blazed down on the cracked pavement of downtown Los Angeles, reflecting off the glass windows of the high-rises and creating shimmering distortions in the heavy afternoon air. The steady hum of traffic blended with the occasional honk of a car horn and the chatter of pedestrians passing by. Naya, a 16-year-old black girl with smooth brown skin and tight curls that framed her delicate face, stood at the bus stop. Her basketball bag was slung over her shoulder, and sweat from practice clung to the back of her jersey. She barely noticed the noise around her as her thumbs moved across the screen of her phone. "On my way home. Love you." She hit send and tucked a loose curl behind her ear, feeling the comforting weight of routine. Just another day. Just another bus ride home. She was thinking about what her mom might be making for dinner when the sound of tires crunching over asphalt pulled her attention away from the phone. A police cruiser rolled up slowly, its tires grinding to a stop right in front of the bus stop. The driver's side door opened with a low creak, and out stepped Officer Derek Collins. Collins was tall and broad, his muscular frame filling out the standard-issue uniform. His shaved head glinted under the sun, and his cold blue eyes were sharp, calculating. There was no kindness in his face, just a permanent scowl etched into the hard lines of his jaw. The heavy belt around his waist sagged slightly from the weight of the baton and gun holstered at his side. His presence seemed to suck the warmth from the afternoon air. "Hey!" His voice cut through the noise of the street like a blade. "What are you doing?" Nia froze. Her eyes darted toward him, then back down at her phone. Her heart started beating faster. "Just texting my mom," she said cautiously, keeping her tone level. She'd been taught how to speak to cops. Calm, respectful, non-threatening. Colin's eyes narrowed. "Let me see that phone." Nia frowned, her grip tightening instinctively around the device. "Why?" "Don't ask questions. Hand it over." The harshness in his tone made Nia's stomach clench. A chill crept up her spine despite the heat in the air. Her mouth opened, but the words didn't come. "I didn't do anything." Collins lunged forward without warning. His hand shot out and ripped the phone from her grasp. "Hey!" Nia gasped, stumbling back a step. Collins ignored her. He held the phone up, his thumb swiping across the screen as if searching for something incriminating. His eyes flicked over the last message. "On my way home. Love you." Colin's mouth curled into a sneer. This could be evidence. Nia's brow furrowed. "Evidence of what?" Colin's face darkened. His grip tightened around the phone, and then... Crunch. He dropped the phone to the ground and stomped down with his boot, grinding it into the pavement. The sound of the screen shattering was like glass breaking inside Nia's chest. "Hey!" Nia screamed, stepping forward instinctively. "You can't do that!" Collins's head snapped toward her. He moved in close, so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His face was inches from hers, his blue eyes ice cold. "You think you have rights?" he hissed. Nia's breath hitched. Her heart was hammering in her chest. The pavement beneath her feet seemed to tilt. She stumbled back a step, eyes wide with disbelief. A tremor ran through her hand as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her backup phone. Her mother had always told her to carry a spare, just in case. "Don't!" Collins growled, but her thumb was already pressing down on the emergency contact button. The dial tone buzzed in her ear as she pressed the phone to the side of her face. Her chest was heaving. "Mom!" Her voice cracked. "Help!" Colin's eyes flared with rage. His hand shot out toward the phone. Nia flinched, pulling away, but his grip closed around her wrist like a vice. "I said give it!" His voice was sharp enough to draw the attention of a couple of passers-by down the street. A woman slowed her steps, her gaze flicking toward them, but then she kept walking. "Let me go!" Nia cried, trying to yank her arm free. Colin's face twisted with cold fury. He pulled harder, jerking her toward him. Nia's feet scraped against the pavement as she fought to stay upright. Her heart pounded so loudly it filled her ears. "Who the hell are you calling?" Collins demanded. "My mom," Nia whispered through gritted teeth. "You think your mom's gonna save you?" Colin's lips curled into a cruel smirk. "Good luck with that." Nia's pulse roared in her head. The phone was still pressed against her ear. The line was still open. "Mom, please." A sharp sound cut through the air. The rhythmic click of heels striking pavement. It echoed unnaturally loud against the concrete. The sound was deliberate, purposeful. Colin's head turned toward the sound. A tall figure was walking toward them. Dark tailored suit, razor-sharp heels, black sunglasses. The figure stopped a few feet away and slowly pulled off the sunglasses. "Let her go." The voice was ice-cold and deadly calm. Collins hesitated, still gripping Nia's wrist. "Who the hell are you?" The woman took another step forward. Sunlight reflected off the silver badge pinned to her lapel. "I'm Monica Davis," she said. Collins' brow creased. "Attorney General Monica Davis," she clarified, her tone hard as steel. The blood drained from Collins' face. "Step away from my daughter," Monica ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. Nia's heart lurched. Collins' fingers loosened slightly around her wrist, but he didn't let go. "She was resisting arrest," Collins said weakly. Monica's mouth curved into a humorless smile. "Is that what you're going with?" Collins glanced down at Nia, then back at Monica. His eyes narrowed. "Step away," Monica said again, her tone brooking no argument. Collins' hand fell away from Nia's wrist. She stumbled back, breathing hard. Monica was at her side in an instant, steadying her. "You okay?" Monica asked, her eyes scanning Nia for any sign of injury. Nia nodded, tears burning in her eyes. He smashed my phone." "I saw." Monica's voice was dark with anger. Collins took a step back, his jaw working. "You can't." Monica stepped toward him. "I can. And I will." Collins's mouth opened to protest, but Monica was already reaching into her blazer pocket. She pulled out a thin black phone and raised it to her ear. "Yes, I need 2 federal agents at my location," Monica said smoothly. "Now." Collins's eyes widened. He took a shaky step back. "You think you're untouchable?" Monica's gaze was sharp enough to cut through steel. "You're about to find out just how wrong you are." Collins' mouth twisted into an ugly sneer, but his eyes flicked toward the approaching black SUVs that had just turned onto the street. Nia's hand gripped her mother's arm. Monica squeezed her hand gently. "It's over," Monica said softly, but Nia wasn't so sure. Collins's hand clamped down around Nia's wrist like a steel trap. His fingers dug into her skin with brutal strength, and a sharp bolt of pain shot up her arm. Nia twisted her body, trying to yank herself free, but his grip only tightened. Her breath hitched in her throat. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the hot afternoon air like a knife. Collins yanked her closer, his face inches from hers. His eyes were sharp and predatory, his breath hot and sour against her cheek. "You're resisting arrest," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "For what?" Nia's voice cracked, but she forced herself to stand her ground, even as fear coiled like ice in her chest. Her heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would punch through her ribcage. Colin's eyes narrowed. A thin, ugly smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I don't need a reason," he hissed. Nia's eyes widened. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. She had done nothing. She had been standing at a bus stop texting her mom. That's it. No crime, no threat. And yet, here she was, trapped, powerless, with a grown man in uniform crushing her wrist like he was entitled to it. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run. But how could she when he had her locked in place? Her other hand curled into a fist at her side. She forced her voice to steady. "Let me go." Colin's smile widened. His fingers squeezed harder. Pain bloomed under her skin, and tears welled in her eyes. "You think you have power here?" His voice was cold, almost amused. "You don't." Naya's throat constricted. She twisted her arm again, trying to pry herself loose, but his grip was too strong. The rough fabric of his uniform sleeve brushed against her skin, the insignia on his chest almost mocking in its authority. "You think your mom's gonna help you?" Colin sneered. His eyes glinted dangerously under the sun. "Good luck with that." Terror surged through her veins, sharp and dizzying. The phone was still pressed against her ear. The line was still open. Her mother was listening. "Mom." Naya's voice broke. "Please." Colin's hand shot out and knocked the phone from her hand. It hit the pavement with a dull crack and skidded to the side, screen down. Naya gasped. "Hey!" She bent toward it, but Collins yanked her upright by the arm, hard enough to make her shoulder burn. "You're done talking," he said. Naya's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered painfully in her chest as her brain screamed at her to do something. "Let me go!" Nia shouted, twisting her body. Colin's hand shot to her other wrist, locking both her arms in his iron grip. He was too strong. Her feet scraped against the concrete as he dragged her closer, his mouth curling into a sadistic smile. "You really want to do this the hard way?" Naya's pulse roared in her ears. A hot wave of panic rose up her throat. A sharp clicking sound cut through the haze of panic. Click, click, click. High heels on pavement. Steady. Measured. Colin's head lifted slightly at the sound. His grip didn't loosen. Click, click. Closer now. Naya's breath hitched. From the corner of her eye, she saw a tall figure approaching. Dark suit, black sunglasses, stride purposeful and lethal. Click, click. Collins's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. The figure stopped just a few feet away. "Let her go!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the thick air with the weight of absolute authority. Nia's head whipped toward the sound. The figure removed her sunglasses, revealing dark eyes framed by perfect, razor-sharp brows. Her face was hard as stone, jaw tight with barely contained fury. Colin's hands remained locked around Naya's wrists. His mouth curled downward. "Who the hell are you?" The woman took another step forward. Her black heels scraped against the pavement, slow and deliberate. Her suit was flawless. Jet black, tailored to perfection, not a wrinkle in sight. The sun caught on the thin silver badge pinned to her lapel. The woman's gaze was ice cold. Her voice was controlled, precise. "I'm Monica Davis," she said. Colin's brows creased. "Attorney General Monica Davis," she clarified. Nia's breath caught in her throat. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribcage. Colin's grip finally loosened. His hands fell away from Nia's wrists. Monica's gaze sharpened. Her eyes cut through him like glass. "Step away from my daughter," she said, her tone edged with quiet menace. Colin's mouth opened. He glanced at Nia, then back at Monica. "She was resisting arrest." "No." Monica's eyes burned with steel-cold fury. She wasn't. Colin's jaw tightened. His shoulders squared. I was just doing my job. Threatening a child? Monica stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. Breaking her property? Collins took a half step back. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Monica's eyes darkened. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next. Naya's breath hitched. The pressure of Collins's grip was still imprinted on her skin. Her pulse roared in her ears as adrenaline continued to surge through her veins. You think you're untouchable? Monica's voice was sharp as a knife. You're about to find out how wrong you are. Colin's face flushed red. His mouth curled into a sneer. You don't scare me. Monica's lips curled upward in a slow, dangerous smile. Good, she said. That'll make this more fun. Collins's eyes darted to the street behind Monica, and Naya saw it too. A black SUV with tinted windows was turning the corner, slowing as it approached the curb. The heavy tires rolled to a stop. Monica's gaze didn't waver. Last chance, she said. Step away. Colin's jaw twitched. For a moment, he didn't move. Then his hands slowly lifted, his palms facing outward. He took a step back. Monica's eyes followed him the entire way. Two men in dark suits emerged from the SUV. Their movements were precise, their faces impassive. One of them spoke into an earpiece. Monica didn't take her eyes off Collins. Nia's breathing was still ragged. Her hands were trembling at her sides. Are you okay? Monica asked without looking away from Collins. Nia's throat tightened. Yeah. Monica's hand curled around Nia's shoulder. Good. Stay right there. Collins's eyes flicked toward the approaching men, his fists clenched at his sides. Monica's gaze sharpened. You're going to pay for this. Collins spat. Monica's smile widened coldly. No, she said. You are. Collins' mouth twisted into an ugly snarl, just as one of the men in suits stepped forward, flashing a badge. Officer Collins, the agent said calmly. You're under investigation for misconduct and excessive use of force. We'd like you to come with us. Collins's face went pale. Monica's hand tightened on Naya's shoulder. It's over, she said softly, but Nia wasn't so sure. The sleek black SUV had rolled to a stop so smoothly that no one had noticed it at first, not even Collins. The tinted windows reflected the harsh afternoon sun, casting back the distorted shapes of the crowded street. Then the door opened with a quiet, controlled click, and out stepped a tall black woman, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who knew the weight of her own authority. Her suit was black, pitch black, so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been sculpted to her body. Razor-sharp lapels framed the silver badge pinned to her chest. Her heels clicked against the concrete with a sound so precise it cut through the noise of the street like a scalpel. Her hair was drawn into a flawless bun at the nape of her neck, and not a single strand was out of place. The cold afternoon light reflected off her dark sunglasses as she stepped toward them, her stride long and purposeful. The moment she appeared, the atmosphere around the scene seemed to shift. Conversations nearby slowed, then stopped. People on the street turned, sensing the sudden change in energy. Step away from my daughter, Her voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. No raised volume, no trembling tone. It was controlled, the kind of voice sharpened by years of courtroom battles and press conferences. The tone of a woman accustomed to having her commands obeyed without question. Colin's head snapped toward her. His grip on Nia's wrist loosened as his mind worked to make sense of the situation. His pale blue eyes narrowed beneath his furrowed brow, but there was a flicker of something underneath the surface. Uncertainty. Who the hell are you? The woman stopped a few feet away from them. She took off her sunglasses slowly, revealing dark, calculating eyes that cut through Colin's like a laser. "I'm Monica Davis," she said. Collins's mouth twitched. His brow creased. He knew the name. Everyone knew the name. But his mind seemed to reject the possibility. "Attorney General Monica Davis," she clarified, her voice hard as steel. Nia felt Collins's hand release her wrist instantly, like his skin had brushed against open flame. Her arm dropped to her side, and she instinctively rubbed the spot where his fingers had left red marks against her skin. Colin's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since this started, he looked genuinely uncertain. The confidence that had been oozing from him, the arrogance, drained from his face as his mind caught up with the weight of the situation. "Shit," Collins muttered under his breath. Monica's eyes narrowed. Her gaze cut into him like a knife. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Collins's jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. He looked like a cornered animal, trying to assess whether the threat was real or bluff. It was real. "You assaulted my daughter," Monica said, her voice as calm as before. Colin's gaze flicked toward Nia, then back to Monica. "She was resisting arrest." "Resisting what?" Monica's brow arched slightly. "Standing at a bus stop?" Colin's mouth twisted. He tried to square his shoulders, to reclaim the authority that had evaporated the moment Monica stepped out of that SUV. "I had reasonable suspicion," Colin said, his voice hardening. Monica's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Oh? And what exactly gave you reasonable suspicion?" Colin's mouth opened. No words came out. "I'm waiting," Monica said. His eyes darkened. She reached for something in her pocket. "Her phone," Monica said flatly. "It could have been a weapon." "It was a phone," Monica repeated, her tone icy. "Which you destroyed." Collins's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job." Monica took another step toward him, close enough now that Collins had to tilt his chin slightly to maintain eye contact. Despite his broad frame, Monica carried the weight of dominance in the space between them. "If this is how you do your job," Monica said, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper, "then we have a problem." Collins' fists twitched at his sides. His breath quickened. Nia watched, wide-eyed, as her mother systematically dismantled the officer without so much as raising her voice. "Let me guess," Monica continued, her voice sharp as glass. "No body cam footage? No official report? No probable cause?" Colin's mouth tightened. "No," Monica said, answering her own question. "Because this was never about doing your job. This was about power." Colin's face reddened. His hands twitched again, but he still didn't speak. "I've dealt with your type before." Monica's eyes were steady and unblinking. "The badge gives you a sense of control. You think that makes you untouchable?" Colin's jaw clenched. His lips pulled into a sneer. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice low. Monica's eyes flashed with something dark and dangerous. "Good," she said. "That'll make this more interesting." A flicker of motion at the edge of Nia's vision made her heart jolt. 2 black SUVs had pulled up behind Monica's car. Black-suited men stepped out, clean-cut, impassive, earpieces coiled behind their ears. Collins' gaze flicked toward them. His posture tightened. He was calculating his options, but the narrowing of his eyes gave him away. He already knew he was cornered. "You think this is over?" Collins said. Monica's smile widened, but it didn't touch her eyes. "I haven't even started." Collins' mouth opened to protest, but the two agents were already walking toward him. "Officer Collins?" One of the agents held up a badge. "We need you to come with us." Collins' eyes darkened. "On what grounds?" "Violation of civil rights, destruction of property, excessive use of force, unlawful detainment of a minor." Collins' face contorted. "This is bullshit. Come quietly," the agent interrupted, his tone flat. "Or we'll escalate." Collins' eyes darted toward Monica, his face twisting with hate. "You can't do this," he snarled. Monica's expression didn't change. "I already have." One of the agents stepped behind Collins and pulled out a pair of cuffs. "You're going to regret this." Collins spat as the cold steel locked around his wrists. Monica's gaze sharpened. "I hope you're right." Collins was led toward the SUV. His face was bright red. His shoulders were tight. His jaw was trembling with suppressed rage. Monica's gaze tracked him until the car door shut behind him with a final, hollow clunk. The agents nodded toward Monica and moved toward their vehicles. The street was quiet now. The crowd that had gathered was whispering, heads turning toward Monica and Nia. Monica turned toward her daughter. "Are you okay?" Her voice was softer now. Nia's lip trembled. Monica's hand came up, brushing a curl from Nia's forehead. "It's over," Monica said softly. But Nia's breath was still coming fast. Her wrists still ached where Collins' hands had been. Monica's eyes darkened. "It's over for him," Monica said. "But this is just beginning." Monica moved like a blade cutting through the air, sharp, direct, and deadly. Her heels clicked once against the pavement as she positioned herself between Nia and Collins, her body a shield. The tension in the air thickened instantly. The crowd that had begun to gather just outside the edges of the scene held its collective breath. Eyes widened. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Collins's face twitched as he stood frozen in place, his jaw working as his brain scrambled to recalibrate. He still hadn't processed how the situation had spiraled so rapidly out of his control. His eyes darted between Monica and Nia, but his body was rooted to the ground, muscles coiled beneath his uniform like a spring about to snap. "You assaulted my daughter?" Monica's voice cut through the thick, humid air like a scalpel. Collins' throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but the words stuck. His hand instinctively flexed at his side, as though the feeling of Nia's wrist was still imprinted on his palm. I was just doing my job," Collins finally stammered. Monica's head tilted slightly, her dark eyes narrowing to slits. "Your job?" The venom in her tone was palpable, each word sharp and precise. "Stomping on the property of a minor? Threatening a child?" A flicker of panic passed through Collins's eyes before he could stop it. His mouth opened again, but Monica's eyes sharpened into daggers, cutting him down before he could speak. Nia's breath was shaky, her body tense as Monica's hand curled protectively around her shoulder. The warmth of her mother's hand was steady, grounding, but Nia could feel the barely controlled rage simmering beneath Monica's calm exterior. Monica's gaze didn't waver. Her stare was ice cold, stripped of all pretense of civility, the kind of look that could dismantle a grown man with a single glance. "Did you really think you'd get away with this?" Monica's tone was low, dangerous, like the quiet before a storm. Collins' mouth tightened. His jaw flexed. His eyes darted toward the growing crowd, searching for support, but the expressions staring back at him weren't sympathetic. People were holding up phones, recording, watching. Nia's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She could see the calculation behind Colin's eyes, the desperate attempt to figure out his next move. He had already lost control of the situation, and now he was trying to decide whether to escalate or retreat. "Ma'am," Colin said, his voice straining toward some semblance of authority. "You need to calm down." "Calm down?" Monica's brow lifted, dark amusement flashing in her eyes. "You assaulted my daughter, and you think I should calm down?" Collins took a shaky breath. His face was visibly flushed now, sweat forming along his hairline despite the cooling breeze that had picked up. "I followed standard protocol," Collins insisted. Monica's expression hardened. "Standard protocol," she repeated icily. "Explain to me which part of standard protocol allows you to destroy a teenager's phone and physically restrain her on the street?" Collins' mouth twisted. She was resisting what? Monica's tone sharpened. "Answer the question, Officer Collins." Collins' lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. His hands flexed at his sides. A muscle twitched along his jawline. Monica took a step forward. Collins instinctively took a step back. "I said answer the question," Monica repeated. The crowd murmured. Someone's phone camera light blinked to life. "You think this is funny?" Monica's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "You think this is some minor incident that will be forgotten by tomorrow's news cycle?" Collins' gaze darkened. His eyes flicked toward the approaching black SUV with tinted windows that had pulled up at the curb. He wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move," Monica said, her voice scalpel sharp. Collins' nostrils flared. His shoulders squared as he straightened his back, trying to salvage the thin threads of authority that were unraveling in real time. Monica's eyes didn't so much as blink. "Step aside." Collins's jaw worked. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "I'm trying to handle this situation professionally," he said, his voice thin with forced control. "And now I'm handling it," Monica said coolly. Collins didn't move. Monica's eyes sharpened. "I said step aside." The force behind her words struck Collins like a slap. His face twisted into a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His gaze flicked toward the crowd again. All those phones, all those eyes. His options were closing rapidly. The growing pressure in the air was almost tangible. The crowd was silent, drawn into the standoff like spectators at a high-stakes fight. Collins' gaze returned to Monica, his blue eyes burning with resentment. For a split second, Nia thought he might lash out, that the humiliation burning in his chest might push him toward a reckless decision. Then Monica's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift in expression that said, "Try it." Collins's fists twitched. His chest heaved as he struggled to get his breathing under control. Monica's chin lifted half an inch. "Step. Aside." A single heartbeat of silence. Collins's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His hands opened, fingers flexing, his mouth twisted, but he took a slow step back. Then another. His hands lifted slightly in a gesture of surrender. Monica didn't move. Her gaze followed him as he backed away. Nia let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Collins' face was flushed an ugly shade of red. His eyes still burned with lingering hostility, but he didn't speak. He turned sharply on his heel and took 2 steps toward the sidewalk, putting distance between himself and Monica. Monica's eyes tracked him the entire way, hard and unblinking. She wasn't satisfied with his retreat. She was cataloging every detail, calculating every consequence. Collins stopped just at the edge of the street, his back stiff, his mouth pressed into a tight line. His gaze darted toward Monica one last time, his expression a toxic cocktail of humiliation and barely contained rage. Monica's lips curled slightly. Not a smile. A warning. Her gaze flicked toward one of the bystanders holding up a phone. Her voice lifted, controlled, and cutting. "Did you get all of that?" The person holding the phone nodded silently. "Good," Monica said. Her gaze cut back toward Collins. "Because if you think this ends here, Officer Collins," her voice darkened, "you're very much mistaken." Collins' expression tightened. His hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't move. He knew better now. Monica turned toward Naya, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "You okay?" Monica's voice softened slightly. Nia nodded shakily. Monica's gaze lingered on Nia's reddened wrist. Her jaw tightened. "We'll talk about this later," Monica said softly. Then her gaze snapped back toward Collins. Her eyes darkened. "But right now," her voice sharpened, "this conversation isn't over." Collins' mouth curled into an ugly sneer, but he stayed where he was. He had already lost. He knew it. Monica stood tall, her arm draped protectively over Naya's shoulder as she turned her back on Collins. The scene was over, but the war was just beginning. The black SUVs glided to a stop so smoothly they barely made a sound. The dark-tinted windows reflected the harsh afternoon sun, distorting the shapes of the crowd that had gathered. For a brief second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The low hum of engines faded as the SUV's doors swung open with a muted click. Two men stepped out, moving with quiet, dangerous precision. Black suits, earpieces curling behind their ears, faces devoid of emotion. The unmistakable glint of FBI badges flashed at their belts as they approached the scene with the calculated calm of men who had done this countless times before. Their presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. The low murmur of the crowd died completely. All eyes turned toward them. "Attorney General Davis?" one of the agents said, his tone crisp, professional. Monica didn't hesitate. Her eyes remained locked on Collins. She nodded. "Arrest him." Collins' head whipped toward her, his mouth dropping open. A sharp breath escaped his throat. His expression contorted into something wild and dangerous, a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't! His words stumbled over each other as his face flushed red. His composure, the last shred of his carefully cultivated dominance, fractured beneath the weight of the moment. One of the agents moved toward him with clinical efficiency, already reaching for the cuffs. Collins stepped back instinctively, his hands lifting as though to defend himself. His gaze darted toward the growing crowd, searching for support, for backup, for anything. "This is bullshit," he snarled. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Monica's eyes flashed coldly. "Assaulting a minor? Destroying evidence? Unlawful detainment?" Collins' breath quickened. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. The phone cameras pointed directly at his face. His gaze darted wildly from side to side, seeking an escape route, but there wasn't one. Two agents stepped forward simultaneously. One of them gripped Collins' left arm. "Get your hands off me!" Collins roared, yanking his arm back with a violent twist. The second agent was faster. His hand shot out and clamped down on Collins's right wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced precision. Collins grunted in pain. His body bucked against the hold, but the agents were immovable. "You're under arrest for assault, destruction of property, and unlawful use of force," one of the agents said, his tone cool and detached. "This is insane!" Collins growled through clenched teeth as the cold bite of metal locked around his wrists. "Stop resisting," the agent warned. Collins thrashed against the hold. His face was burning red now, veins bulging at his temples. "You're making a mistake." Monica stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement with a deadly rhythm. Her gaze sharpened, cutting into Collins like a knife. "No." Monica said coldly. You made a mistake. Colin's mouth twisted into an ugly snarl. His eyes blazed with fury. You don't understand? No, Monica interrupted. You don't understand. Colin's breath was ragged. His body jerked against the agent's grip, but they held him steady. You think that badge makes you untouchable? Monica's voice was low, controlled. You think it gives you a free pass to terrorize whoever you want? You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Colin spat, his voice cracking under the strain of his own rage. Monica's eyes narrowed. Neither do you. The agents began moving him toward the SUV. Colin's boots scraped against the pavement as they dragged him forward. He twisted his body violently, but their grip was ironclad. His breath was coming fast now, sharp and uneven. Panic crept into his eyes beneath the rage. This is political, Colin screamed. I'm being set up. Monica's expression didn't change. Keep telling yourself that. Collins's head jerked toward the crowd. You're all gonna regret this, he shouted. All of you. A ripple of sound passed through the crowd, a low murmur mixed with quiet scoffs and disgusted whispers. Someone near the front laughed under their breath. Another person called out, Shut the hell up. Colin's mouth curled into a sneer. You think this is over? His eyes flicked toward Monica. You think this ends here? Monica's gaze sharpened. No. Colin's mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Monica leaned in slightly, her eyes burning cold. It ends with you behind bars. Collins's breath hitched. His shoulders tensed beneath the agent's hands. You don't know who you're dealing with, Collins hissed. People have my back. You'll regret this. Monica's smile was thin and sharp. I wouldn't count on that. One of the agents opened the back door of the SUV. Colin's eyes darted toward it, then back toward the crowd. His breathing quickened. He dug his heels into the ground as the agents pushed him forward. No! Collins twisted violently, his face twisting with rage. No! Let me go! You can't... Get in the car, one of the agents said flatly. Listen to me. Collins's body jolted as he was shoved into the back seat. You can't. You have no idea what you're starting. Monica stepped toward the open car door. Collins's eyes locked onto hers. His chest was heaving, his mouth twisted. This isn't over, Collins growled. Monica's smile sharpened. I hope not. The agent shut the door. Clunk. Collins's face was framed behind the tinted glass, mouth twisted, eyes wide and burning with fury. His wrists were locked in place behind him, his shoulders tight. He was still shouting, but the closed door muted the sound. Monica's gaze lingered for a moment on the dark outline of his figure behind the glass. Then she turned toward Nia. The crowd erupted into cheers. Naya's head lifted as the sound crashed over them, loud, raw, triumphant. The noise of it reverberated through her chest, vibrating in her bones. She could see phones held high, faces wide with relief and satisfaction. Colin's name was already being whispered between them. Accusations, curses. His face, twisted in rage, was already spreading through social media at light speed. Nia's breath caught. Her hand curled at her side. Monica's hand found her shoulder. Her mother's grip was steady, solid, grounding. "Are you okay?" Monica asked softly. Nia nodded, her throat tightening. Monica's eyes darkened as they slid toward the SUV. "It's not over," she said quietly. "Not yet." Nia swallowed hard. "What happens now?" Monica's gaze sharpened. "Now?" She exhaled, her breath slow and even. "Now we finish this." The SUVs pulled away from the curb, their dark shapes disappearing down the street. Colin's face was still twisted in rage behind the glass, but it was already too late. Justice was already closing in. Monica's heels scraped softly against the pavement as the black SUV disappeared down the street. The sound of the cheering crowd was beginning to fade, replaced by the low hum of city traffic and the occasional distant horn. The adrenaline that had propelled the last few minutes forward, sharp and relentless, was beginning to ebb, leaving a thick, heavy quietness in its wake. Monica's gaze lingered on the empty space where Collins had stood just minutes ago. The tension in her jaw was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of tightly controlled restraint that only someone well-practiced in managing conflict could maintain. Her eyes darkened as the weight of what had just happened began to settle over them. She turned toward Nia. "Are you okay?" Monica's voice was low but steady. Her hand found Nia's shoulder, fingers curling protectively against the soft fabric of her hoodie. Nia nodded slowly. Her breath was shaky, and tears were still glistening at the corners of her eyes. "I'm okay." But she didn't sound okay. Her voice was thin, frayed at the edges. Her chest was still rising and falling in uneven bursts. The hand at her side was trembling, the outline of her fingertips starkly pale against her brown skin. Monica crouched down to Nia's level. The sharp lines of her suit softened as she bent her knees, bringing herself face to face with her daughter. "It's over," Monica said quietly. Her gaze was steady, but there was a softness behind it, the warmth of a mother grounding her child after a storm. Nia's breath hitched. Her throat tightened painfully. The weight of the last 10 minutes pressed down on her chest like a slab of concrete. "For now," Nia whispered. Monica's eyes sharpened at that. A flicker of tension pulled at the corner of her mouth. Her jaw tightened for a brief second before she forced the reaction away. "It's never over." Monica's voice dropped lower. Her hand slid from Nia's shoulder to the side of her face, her thumb brushing across her daughter's cheek. "That's why we have to keep fighting." Nia's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from exhaustion, from the bone-deep understanding that this wasn't over, that it might never be over. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What if he comes back?" Monica's mouth twitched faintly. It wasn't a smile, not really, but the ghost of one. "He won't." Nia's eyes widened. "How do you know?" Monica's gaze darkened. "Because he knows what happens next." There was a chilling certainty behind Monica's tone, a quiet, lethal edge that left no room for doubt. Monica wasn't just confident that Collins wouldn't return. She was guaranteeing it. Nia swallowed hard. Her chest still felt tight, her limbs weak and shaky from the adrenaline crash. But Monica's hand was steady against her face. Her mother's gaze, piercing and unyielding, held her in place, anchoring her. "Come here," Monica said softly. Nia didn't hesitate. She moved forward and let Monica's arms wrap around her. Her mother's grip was firm, solid, her shoulder pressed tightly against Nia's cheek. Nia's breath shuddered as her arms curled around Monica's waist, her fingers clutching the fabric of her jacket. Monica's hand slid up Nia's back, smoothing over her curls. "You're safe," she whispered. Nia's eyes squeezed shut. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But the image of Collins's face, that cold, hateful sneer, was still burned into her mind. The sound of his boot smashing her phone, the pressure of his fingers wrapped around her wrist, the casual violence behind his actions, like it was second nature to him, like it wasn't the first time, like it wouldn't be the last. Monica pulled back slightly, enough to cup Nia's face in both hands. "Listen to me," she said, her voice sharp with quiet urgency. "He's done." Nia's breath hitched. "But what if—" "He's done." The finality in Monica's tone left no room for argument. It was a statement of fact. Nia's chest tightened. "What if it's not just him?" Monica's gaze sharpened. Her thumbs brushed gently over Nia's cheeks. "Then we'll fight harder." Nia hesitated. "How can you be so sure?" Monica's gaze didn't waver. "Because I know what he fears." A tremor passed through Nia's chest. "What does he fear?" Monica's eyes flashed with steel. "Accountability." The word hung between them, heavy with the weight of centuries of injustice. Nia's pulse hammered beneath her skin. "He's not the only one, though." "No," Monica agreed. "He's not." Nia's shoulders sagged. The fight drained from her limbs. The exhaustion hit her all at once. The emotional fallout from the adrenaline, the sheer mental strain of the last 10 minutes unraveling her from the inside out. "I'm tired," Nia whispered. Monica's lips pressed together. "I know." Nia's head dropped slightly. Monica's hands moved to her shoulders, steadying her. "It's not fair," Nia said. Monica's gaze softened. "No, it's not. I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't," Monica agreed. Nia's throat tightened painfully. "Then why does it feel like I lost?" Monica's brows pulled together. A flicker of grief passed through her gaze. Brief, but unmistakable. "Because the system was never designed for us to win," Monica said quietly. Nia's eyes filled with tears again. Monica's hand slid to the back of Nia's neck. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Nia's breath hitched. Her chin trembled. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Monica's grip tightened. "Yes, you can. But what if—" "Yes," Monica repeated. "You can." Nia's lips pressed together. "How?" Monica's gaze sharpened. "Because you're not alone." Nia's breath stuttered. "You don't carry this weight alone," Monica said. "And you don't fight this fight alone." "But what if I'm scared?" Monica's hand brushed over her cheek. "You fight anyway." Nia's chin trembled. "What if I lose?" Monica's eyes darkened. "Then you get up and fight harder." Nia's breath shuddered. "And if I can't?" Monica's gaze softened. "Then I'll fight for you." Nia's shoulders sagged as a fresh wave of tears slid down her cheeks. Monica pulled her into another tight embrace. Nia's arms wrapped around her mother's back, her face pressed against the smooth fabric of Monica's suit. "You're not alone," Monica whispered again. Nia's breath steadied slowly. Her fingers curled into the back of Monica's jacket. "I'm not alone," Nia repeated softly. Monica smiled faintly. "No," she said. "You never will be." The office was quiet, but the air inside it felt charged, thick with unspoken tension and the weight of what was about to be uncovered. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind Monica overlooked the Los Angeles skyline, the city lights stretching out in a haze of blue and gold beneath the darkening sky. A thin line of crimson light from the setting sun sliced across the polished oak desk, catching on the steel edges of Monica's pen and the smooth glass of the water sitting untouched beside her hand. Monica sat perfectly upright in her chair, her back straight, hands clasped tightly together. Her tailored black suit was pristine, not a single crease visible, and the sharp white collar of her blouse framed her neck like armor. Her expression was calm, calculated, but beneath the surface, her pulse was thrumming with cold fury. Two FBI agents sat across from her. They were both dressed in the same dark suits, crisp white shirts and thin black ties. The older of the two, a man with silver hair cropped close to his scalp, held a thin manila folder in his hand. His partner, younger and leaner with sharp brown eyes, sat back slightly in his chair, watching Monica carefully. The hum of the city outside was faint, almost a distant echo beneath the low hum of the office's air conditioning. "Collins has a history of misconduct," the older agent said, his voice level but heavy with implication. Monica's eyes sharpened. Her hands tightened slightly where they rested on the smooth surface of the desk. "How deep?" Monica's tone was cold, precise, the voice of a prosecutor dissecting a case in open court. The older agent slid the folder across the desk toward her. Monica didn't open it. Her gaze remained locked on the agent's face. "Cover-ups," the agent said. "Racial profiling, excessive force complaints." His jaw tightened slightly. None of them followed up. Monica's hands curled into fists. A spike of cold rage shot down her spine. Her gaze darkened as her mind began to work through the implications. "And why wasn't anything followed up?" Monica asked, her voice sharp. The older agent's gaze flicked toward his partner for the briefest second before returning to Monica. "The department protected him." Monica's jaw tightened. Her knuckles whitened where her hands pressed against the desk. "Of course they did," she said, her tone laced with bitterness. "How long?" 15 years. Monica's gaze sharpened. 15 years? The younger agent nodded. Collins was fast-tracked through the academy. His background was clean, but complaints started coming in within the first 2 years on the force. Excessive force during traffic stops. Harassment of Black and Latino citizens. Several reports of intimidation. And none of it stuck. Monica's eyes narrowed dangerously. "No," the older agent said, "because his superior officers buried the reports, covered for him." Monica's hands curled more tightly into fists. Her breath was steady, but the pressure behind her chest was building. "How high does it go?" The older agent hesitated. "How high?" Monica repeated, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Deputy Chief Rogers," the agent said reluctantly, "and possibly higher." Monica's brow lifted slightly. "You're telling me that the deputy chief of the LAPD has been protecting a known abuser for over a decade?" "Yes." Monica's jaw twitched. "Why?" "Collins has been useful to them," the younger agent said. Monica's gaze sharpened. "Useful how?" The younger agent leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the edge of the desk. "He was their enforcer. When someone needed to be pressured, when a suspect needed to be handled, Collins was the guy they sent in. He was brutal but effective, and they kept him clean on paper." Monica's eyes darkened. "So he was their weapon." The younger agent's lips twitched. "Exactly." Monica's breath was steady, but her pulse was hammering beneath the surface. "How many complaints are we talking about?" The older agent flipped open the file. 37 official complaints on record, he said. "But that's just what made it to paper. We suspect there are more, possibly twice that number, that were never documented." Monica's hand curled over the edge of the desk. "And how many of those were for excessive force?" 26. Monica's gaze sharpened. And how many involved black citizens? 23. A muscle tightened along Monica's jawline. Of course. The older agent's face was tight, the lines around his mouth drawn. Several of the complaints involved minors. Nia wasn't the first. Monica's eyes flashed dangerously. The younger agent's gaze flicked toward the window for a moment before he spoke. Collins was a problem they didn't want to solve. He was doing their dirty work. He was useful to them. Until he wasn't. Until Nia. Monica's voice was cold. Until Nia, the younger agent agreed. Monica's breath hitched. Her knuckles were white where her hands gripped the desk. And the department just let him operate unchecked? The older agent's mouth tightened. Yes. For 15 years. Yes. Monica's eyes narrowed. And you're telling me none of this reached internal affairs? Oh, it reached them, the older agent said. But every time the reports were buried, paperwork lost, witnesses disappeared, evidence misplaced. Monica's gaze sharpened. Names. The older agent hesitated. Names, Monica repeated, her tone low and lethal. The older agent pulled another sheet from the folder. Captain Ray Daniels, Lieutenant Eric Moore, Sergeant Ted Coleman. Monica's gaze darkened with each name. They protected him. They protected him. Monica's fingers drummed once against the polished wood surface of the desk. Her eyes burned cold beneath the dim light of the office. And how many of them are still on the force? All of them. Monica's eyes darkened. Not anymore. The younger agent's brow lifted slightly. What exactly are you thinking? Monica's gaze sharpened. I'm thinking it's time to clean house. The older agent's mouth pressed into a thin line. That's going to cause fallout. Good, Monica said coldly. Let it fall. The older agent hesitated. Collins isn't going to go quietly. He's going to pull strings. He's going to lean on his contacts. Monica's smile was thin and sharp. Let him. The younger agent's brow creased. He's dangerous. So am I, Monica said. The older agent sat back slightly. This won't stop with Collins. I know. If you go after the department, they're going to push back hard. Monica's gaze sharpened. I hope they do. The younger agent smiled faintly. We're behind you. Just say the word. Monica's lips curled into a hard, dangerous smile. Consider the word given. The older agent shut the file and rose from his seat. His partner followed. They nodded once toward Monica before stepping toward the door. Keep us informed, the older agent said. Monica's eyes narrowed. You'll know when it happens. The agents left the office, the sound of the door closing behind them soft but final. Monica sat back slowly, her gaze lingering on the folder. Her pulse was steady. Her hands were still. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the cool surface of the desk. It's not over, she whispered to herself, and it wouldn't be. Not until every last person responsible paid the price. The footage hit the internet like a lightning strike. Within hours, it spread across every major social media platform, every news site, and every television network. The video, only 2 minutes and 48 seconds long, was brutal in its simplicity. Grainy phone camera footage captured every second of the encounter. The moment Collins grabbed Nia's wrist, the sound of her phone shattering beneath his boot, the twisted snarl on his face as he yanked her toward him, the fear in Nia's voice, the cold, clinical violence of Collins's grip, and then the sharp sound of heels clicking against pavement. The sudden shift in the air as Monica Davis emerged from the black SUV, the ice in her voice as she said, "Step away from my daughter." It was the kind of video that stuck with you, the kind of video that made your stomach clench and your pulse spike, the kind of video you couldn't forget even if you wanted to. The news stations ran it on a loop, the talking heads dissecting every frame with surgical precision. Was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of abuse? How many complaints have been filed against Officer Collins? Where was internal affairs? Why wasn't he stopped sooner? On social media, the outrage was instant and overwhelming. The hashtags flooded in within minutes. Hashtag justice for Nia. Hash hold them accountable. No justice, no peace. Celebrities weighed in. Politicians made statements. Athletes posted messages of solidarity. The conversation wasn't just about Nia anymore. It was about the system, the cover-ups, the silence, the complicity. How many more cases like this have been buried? One reporter asked on a live broadcast. Monica was sitting in her office when she saw it. Her eyes darkened as the words registered. She already knew the answer. Too many. Now the world knew it too. Outside the courthouse, the protest had swelled to over 1,000 people. The air was electric with tension, raw and vibrating under the weight of collective anger. Cardboard signs waved above the crowd. "Justice for Nia! Accountability now! No justice, no peace!" The chants were deafening. The steady pounding rhythm of voices and fists slamming against protest signs filled the air like a battle cry. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. Nia stood at the top of the courthouse steps, her mother at her side. From this vantage point, she could see the sheer size of the crowd, the way the line of people stretched down the street, past the row of police barriers, wrapping around the block. Nia's heart thudded in her chest. A part of her still couldn't believe any of this was happening. Just days ago, she had been a normal kid, just trying to get home from basketball practice. And now her face was on the news. Her name was on protest signs. People were chanting for her. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. It was too much. It was terrifying. And yet, there was a pulse of strength beneath the fear, a quiet thrum of something sharper, something clearer. Monica's hand rested gently on her daughter's shoulder. "Are you ready for this?" Nia turned toward her mother. Monica's face was calm, her gaze steady, but Nia could see the steel beneath the surface, the barely restrained edge of fury that hadn't dulled since the moment Collins grabbed her. Nia smiled faintly, despite the knot in her chest. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were no longer trembling. Monica's eyes softened. Pride flickered beneath the hard edge of her gaze. "You don't have to speak today if you're not ready," Monica said. "I know." Nia took a breath. "But I want to." Monica's mouth curled into the faintest of smiles. Nia's gaze drifted back toward the crowd. There were faces of all ages, all races, people from different backgrounds, holding different signs. But they were united in purpose, united in anger. A megaphone crackled to life somewhere near the front of the crowd. A young black woman with tight braids and a raised fist began leading the next round of chants. Say her name! Nia Davis! Say her name. Nia Davis! The sound of her own name made Nia's chest tighten. She wasn't sure if it was pride or fear, or maybe both. Come on, Monica said quietly. It's time. They descended the steps together. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Journalists surged toward the barricade, microphones thrust toward them. Ms. Davis. Attorney General Davis. Nia, how are you feeling? Do you plan to press charges? Is Officer Collins going to face criminal charges? Monica's hand tightened slightly against Nia's shoulder. She stopped in front of the line of cameras, her chin lifting slightly. I will take questions in a moment, Monica said. But first, my daughter would like to speak. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Nia saw the flicker of interest behind the reporters' eyes, the sudden tension in their postures. They hadn't expected this. Monica stepped aside, giving Nia the space to step forward. The crowd quieted. The chants died down. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Nia's heart was hammering beneath her ribs, but her face was steady as she stepped toward the microphone. Her voice broke slightly on the first word, but she forced herself to breathe. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, her voice steadying. I didn't ask to have my name on the news. I didn't ask to have people talking about me like I'm some symbol. Her hands tightened on the edge of the podium. But I'm standing here because what happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was part of a pattern, part of a system. A murmur passed through the crowd. And I'm not the first, Nia continued. I'm just the one you saw. Monica's gaze sharpened slightly. Her jaw tightened with quiet pride. Nia's breath hitched. There are other people, other names, kids younger than me, people whose faces you didn't see on the news. She swallowed. I'm standing here for them too. A ripple passed through the crowd. Someone near the front raised a fist. Others followed. And I'm not afraid anymore, Nia said, because I know we're not alone. The crowd erupted into cheers. Monica's eyes darkened as she watched the reporters scramble to capture the moment. Nia's face was steady as she stepped back from the microphone. Monica's hand found her shoulder again. Good job, Monica whispered. Nia's gaze drifted back toward the crowd, toward the raised fists, the signs, the faces filled with anger and hope. We're not done yet, Nia whispered back. Monica smiled faintly. No, she said. We're just getting started. Collins sat stiffly in the courtroom, his hands in cuffs. Officer Collins used excessive force and violated his oath to protect and serve, the prosecutor said. Nia sat in the front row. Her hands trembled. Monica squeezed her hand. Breathe, baby. We've already won. Collins' attorney stood. My client was acting under the authority of the department. No. Monica stood. He was acting under the authority of his own prejudice. The judge's gavel struck down. Guilty. Collins's face turned white. A week later, Nia and Monica stood on the courthouse steps. This is about accountability, Monica said, her voice strong and unwavering. No one is above the law, especially those entrusted to enforce it. Nia squeezed her mother's hand as the cameras flashed. This isn't over, Monica whispered to her daughter. We're going to make sure it never happens again. And if it does? Nia asked. Monica smiled. Then we fight. Nia stood taller, her heart pounding with new strength. Let's go home, Monica said. As they walked away from the cameras, Naya glanced back one last time. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet.